My guest at this time is Pete Sepp. He is president of the National Taxpayers Union. Earlier this month, taxpayers went to the post office, some of them casually, some of them racing against the deadline to get their federal income tax returns in. And there's, of course, the amount that you owe the federal government, whether it's through withholding or ultimately in the final tax returns. But there's also the cost of complying with the federal tax code. And as Pete and I have discussed the new tax laws passed late in 2017, he has consistently brought up the issue of compliance and how he believes, for the most part, things are getting easier for people to comply, and that will save them time and money. But the National Taxpayers Union didn't just speculate. They actually ran the numbers, and now we can give you some hard facts and figures here. So, Pete, thanks so much for being with us.
Always a pleasure.
Well, first of all, what was the goal in this fairly recent, still, tax reform bill when it came to compliance?
One of the goals was to simplify the filing process, especially for those who were itemizing deductions. The fact is that when you use the so-called 1040 long form and all of its associated schedules to claim deductions for charitable contributions, mortgage interest, state and local taxes, the work involved in that adds up pretty quickly. That's why the standard deduction that obviates the need for all of that kind of record keeping was doubled in the tax reform law in order to encourage some 25 million filers who use that long form in the itemized deductions to switch over to the standard deduction. And it appears that many filers are doing so. In fact, so many filers are because the tax software that 90% of Americans use, either themselves or through their preparer, guides them through this process and demonstrates to them that the new standard deduction, the much higher amount, is a better deal, not only for tax savings, but tax compliance savings. It turns out about 241 billion hours of paperwork will be saved by this one new policy.
241 billion hours. Wow.
I'm sorry, 241 million with an M hours.
Still, that's a lot of hours. I don't know what it used to be, but it's definitely a significant drop, I would guess. So let's get to the facts and figures here. So you looked at individual filers as well as business filers, and what did you find?
Well, overall, the total paperwork burden, aside from that 241 million hours in savings, is estimated to be about 8.02 billion with a B hours total. That's for individuals using the 1040 forms, for businesses using the corporate tax return, for small businesses filing the so-called Schedule C with their 1040 returns. That's down. The actual total in 2017, 8.06 billion hours. Now, that doesn't seem like a huge drop. It isn't. But again, you have to look at various areas of the tax system to see where the most savings in labor occurred. One was the standard deduction being increased and more long-form filers doing that. Another was that the alternative minimum tax for individuals has been cut back dramatically to the point where folks who might have had to complete a whole bunch of worksheets to calculate an alternative tax liability no longer have to do that. Unfortunately, there were offsetting increases in paperwork. The new 20% deduction for small businesses required some additional time. Also, on the corporation side, the new international tax rules are still causing a lot of large businesses much more in paperwork. So the net impact is somewhat smaller than the impact you're seeing among 1040 filers only.
So based on what you're seeing this year, Pete, do you expect it to pretty much remain this way as long as the provisions of the current tax law are in place? Will it get a little bit easier and therefore fewer hours as people get more and more accustomed to this? What's your expectation?
I definitely expect it to get easier because once folks understand through their own tax software that the new standard deduction is paying off, they won't be as inclined to deal with all of the record keeping and the constant form filling that requires one to do for itemized deductions. So over time, you'll get bigger savings there. Once businesses learn the new tax rules, that burden might begin to drop a little bit, but Congress does have its work cut out for it in future tax bills to try to simplify the way people declare and pay taxes. Right now, the cost of the net tax compliance burden is, by our estimate, almost 365 billion hours. That's not only out-of-pocket costs for things like software and supplies, it's also the value of time, those 8 billion hours that individuals and businesses spend complying with the income tax.
Do you have much optimism that Congress in its current manifestation is going to be capable of addressing those things?
I think in a way Congress will have to confront some of these things. Those new international tax rules for large businesses I spoke about, the rules that the Treasury wrote in response to the tax cut law are probably not going to work as well in practice as they were written for in theory. We're not going to know about what happens in practice until even later this year, perhaps the year 2020. At that point in time, Congress will have enough feedback to make technical corrections to the bill, which is another opportunity for simplification.
There's the cost of compliance, and then there's the hours and the manpower on the other side. So in other words, if you've got people at your business or for yourself taking time to go through the taxes and file them properly, that's time that they're not doing other things. So what has it meant for productivity? How do we gauge how much greater productivity there is because there's less work being done in this area?
Yeah, that's really an opportunity cost, as economists call it, the fact that because they're doing things like tax compliance paperwork, they're not doing other things such as growing the business, getting that new idea that could suddenly catch fire and employ thousands, even millions more people. So those opportunity costs plus the social costs, the fact that you have less leisure time to spend with your family, they're not easy to quantify, but some economists have said that it could easily double the total of $365 billion that we have calculated.
Pete, fascinating to look at. It's part of the tax burden that doesn't get crunched in with all of the official numbers with the rates and the deductions and all that sort of thing. So it's good to factor all this in as well. Thanks very much for your time today.
My pleasure.
Pete Sepp, president of the National Taxpayers Union. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.